They tell me don't drop the mic. I thought the broadband strategy was a bit of a mic drop moment, but I also know there's a lot of detail yet to come, and I know many of you are very interested in seeing how this is going to roll out. So really happy to be here with you today. Thanks for having me. So happy to be back in Sylvan Lake, and I can't think of a better place for all the folks from rural Alberta across this province who are invested in the future of connectivity to come together than in central Alberta in a small community just like this that plays a very big role in Alberta's economy. And so thanks again for letting me join you. So, I mean, I've got a bit of a speech prepared, but I'm probably going to just stick to it very loosely because I have a pretty good idea of what is on your minds. And so what I wanted to start to talking about was just a bit of a refresher of why this is important, what we have done so far, where we have come from, and then hint a little bit at where we're going, and then let's just get straight to Q&A because I know many of you have questions that you'd like answered. First, let me just say, I know how important universal connectivity is for Alberta. It is critical to our economy. It is critical for the education of our kids. It is critical to skill and talent development for almost any industry. It is critical for healthcare, and it is critical for so many other very important aspects of our society. And ensuring that we have universal access to reliable high-speed internet is a priority for this government. So let's not spend our limited time together talking about why this is important. Let's just know that we are in agreement that it is important, and we're trying to take significant action to deliver results in this space. Where have we come from? Well, you know, Alberta was once a leader in being a bit of a visionary on trying to build connectivity for rural Alberta. Many of you probably know of, at least anecdotally, the Alberta SuperNet, which started over 20 years ago and to date has seen about $1.8 billion of Alberta government resources going into it to connect over 3,000 schools, hospitals, libraries, and municipal buildings and several others in over 300 communities that would probably never have seen a fiber backbone reach their communities had the Alberta government not taken those steps many years ago. Obviously, that was a long time before I was an MLA, and certainly a long time before I ever thought about politics. But it is important to remember that there has been some investment in the past, and that has helped to support many communities. But it was never intended to be a residential internet service, a last mile service. It was intended to be a backbone that services would be built upon and expanded upon. And so I think it's just important to remember that. But in the last 10 or so years, there hasn't really been a whole lot of investment from any level of government other than the odd municipality who has chosen to tackle this on their own. There's been very little federal dollars and no provincial investment. And that, as you all know, technology is evolving very quickly. Connectivity protocols are getting more and more advanced. And so rural Alberta was falling farther and farther behind. And that has led, of course, to what we all talk about many times, which is the creation of the digital divide. And so when I first became a minister in 2019, it became very clear to me that this was probably going to be one of the biggest and most important problems that I inherited, that I was going to need to try and find a way to bring about some significant improvements. I got to work right away, as many of you know, toured across the province in 2019 to meet with as many municipalities and municipal and business leaders as I could, just to listen and to learn and find out how bad is it really on the ground in every corner of our province. And it became very clear to me it's pretty bad, right? I mean, you all can relate. It's pretty bad. So, but that was helpful to inform me, number one, to remind me of the urgency, and number two, to understand that there is no one silver bullet, no one-size-fits-all approach that is going to solve this problem. And so we got to work right away and started working with my department, with our partners in municipalities across the province, with telecommunications and internet companies that have an interest in building more infrastructure in this province, and of course working with our counterparts in the federal government. And over a 2-year period, we got to where we are today today, which is the release of Alberta's broadband strategy. I'm really excited about this. And I know some of you have questions about how is this going to work in practice, but let's not forget how significant this achievement is. We have been able to commit the Alberta government to spending $390 million over the next 4 years. This is a big deal. There has not been a single dollar for broadband investment in over 10 years. This is a big deal. And not only that, we were able to leverage that into convincing the federal government to commit matching dollars, dollar for dollar, another $390 million over the same period of time to infrastructure in Alberta. So we're talking $780 million. But we're not only doing that is the public sector funding, but of course we know there will be partners who are actually going to build this infrastructure. The government of Alberta is not going to build this. We're not good at building this kind of stuff, and we don't want to build this stuff. Federal government doesn't want to build it either, and I don't think any of you want us to be building this infrastructure. This is going to be in partnership with municipalities and with the telecommunications and internet companies who know how to do this and who want to do this and who have a vested interest in the final finished product. But those private sector partners are going to have skin in the game. This is not free money. This is a collaboration between government, multiple levels of government, and the private sector to solve a problem that cannot be solved by any one of us alone. And so if you take the $780 million between the province and the federal government, and you add to that the private sector investment, this is going to be north of $1 billion spent on the hardest to reach corners of the province. The Alberta broadband strategy is a credible plan, it is a funded plan, and it is a big deal. But I understand you still have questions. So let's talk about a few of the key things that I know are likely to be on your minds, and then we'll get to questions for anything that I might not have covered. First of all, as I've said, there is no one-size-fits-all approach that's going to work. We know that there are some areas where fiber to the premise will work and is reasonable with some level of public sector supports. It is a reasonable choice and option. And so Alberta's broadband strategy will facilitate in certain areas some fiber to the premise projects. But we also know that some households and businesses and communities to get to one location would cost tens of thousands, if not over $100,000 for a single location. That is not realistic. I think we all can agree that it would not be wise for a government to spend a couple $100,000 to connect one house. It just will not work. So we need to be mindful of and ensure that our plans have room for other technological opportunities such as fixed wireless and low Earth orbit satellite technology. I'm sure all of you have done a lot of homework on this because this is important to you and it's important to me too. And that is why I'm excited about some of the technological innovations in both of these types of technology. Fixed wireless, as you know, is basically taking a fiber backbone, adding some towers onto it and some wireless broadcast technology that can send it further out. And so you can take a fiber backbone and get very reliable signal out to areas where fiber would not be able to reach otherwise. But it's complicated. I think we all can relate to stories where fixed wireless does not yield good results. And where advertised speeds do not translate to actual speeds on the ground experienced by the users. And there's a number of factors tied to that. Some of it is that the existing wireless technology that has been deployed in Alberta is older and has not had the chance to be upgraded to some of the modern technology protocols that are available and feasible. And so over time, as more and more of the telcos and ISPs invest in expanding their networks, we will start to see significant improvements in wireless technology. But more important than that is spectrum policy. And I believe we'll have someone from the CRTC speaking tomorrow, is that right? So maybe we can get some ideas and cheat sheets for you so that you can grill them tomorrow, because spectrum policy matters. It's complicated, it's very techy, and it's taken me a long time to get my head wrapped around it. But if you were to take a look at Alberta's broadband strategy, you'll see that there's three key focuses that I am taking as minister and my government is taking to advocate with the federal government, because the feds in Alberta, we are aligned in wanting to see the digital divide eliminated. We are united in that goal, and that's good news. But what we have to recognize is that the federal government's spectrum policies are not in alignment with that goal. And in fact, in many cases, are standing as a roadblock, preventing significant private sector investment into wireless technologies across the province that would be far superior to what we are seeing in practice today. And so there's three key things that I think need to change, and I would love for you guys to pick your guest from the CRTC's brain about tomorrow. Number one, right now, when spectrum is being auctioned off, these packages of bandwidth are being offered for specific geographic parcels. So different, think of it almost like provincial ridings in a provincial election, right? You got a riding where I represent, and then a riding where, some folks down in Sylvan, Devin Dreeshen, my colleague here in Sylvan Lake, Innisfail represents, for example. And all across the province, you got these ridings. Well, think about it now in the context of geographical boundaries for spectrum being licensed to bidders. Well, these are designed so that you almost always have an urban portion and a rural portion in the same geographical boundary. And why this is a problem is that the federal government says, okay, if you're going to buy this parcel, you must develop, let's say 60% of it to ensure that 60% of the people covered in this area have access to this level of service. As long as you do that, you can keep ownership of that parcel of spectrum. Well, that sounds good on paper, but when you have urban and rural portions in the same boundary, then you can just serve the urban portion and never touch the rural portion, and you still retain control of that license for that spectrum, and the rural folks will never, ever see reliable wireless internet. This is a big problem. And it is a big part of why many of you who might be only able to get wireless internet right now, why you probably have less than satisfactory results. It's not because wireless doesn't work and can't work. It's because the telcos can't invest into the newest technologies because they don't have access to the spectrum to serve that area, because it's locked up and only being used to serve urban areas. This is a big problem, and it needs to change. And so we are advocating to the feds to say, sell a parcel of urban, sell a parcel of rural, make sure that we have everybody's incentives aligned to say, if you buy this, make sure you're going to develop it. And if you don't want that rural portion, don't buy it. Let someone who does want to develop it buy it. The second piece goes hand in hand with that, which is basically, if you do buy this and you don't develop it, you should lose it. We call it use it or lose it. It's very common sense. It makes sense. And if we had that in practice, then folks would not be bidding up artificially spectrum that they plan to sit on, because it would be a bad investment for them because they know they would lose it. The folks who do end up buying it will get it for cheaper because they're not competing against folks who just want to sit on it and hold it and maybe resell it in the future. And that means the cost comes down, which means the folks who get it will have more resources left to actually spend on building the infrastructure. That's what we all want. We want people to build the infrastructure to deliver a good service. So we'll be pushing the feds on that as well. And hopefully, if that sounds good to you, maybe you can push them too. The third piece is to say, let's make sure that our spectrum policies are set up in such a way that it discourages companies from buying these spectrum licenses and sitting on them undeveloped. I mean, of course, you have to use it or lose it, but folks are often buying this, intending to sit on it for a couple of years and then resell it before they lose it. And they want to sell it at an inflated price. This is financial engineering. Look, let's leave that to Wall Street. We don't need that in Alberta and in Canada when we're talking about trying to invest in building rural connectivity infrastructure. Let's make sure that people know, if you buy this, you should be intending to, and you should have a plan to develop it in that community. And you should not be, that plan should not be to try and resell it to somebody else who ultimately would build it, because we don't want people to be profiting from spectrum as an asset to resell. We want people to be developing it so they can deliver a service, so that they can meet the needs of Albertans and build a business model that is sustainable on that front. So those three things, if we can get the feds to change those three things, it will unleash an enormous amount of private sector investment into wireless infrastructure in rural communities. And I feel very confident that you will be very surprised by the quality of that wireless infrastructure if we can just unleash these unnecessary regulatory hurdles. So, bringing it back to Alberta's broadband strategy. A part of our strategy is about funding. A part of our strategy is about advocacy on federal policies that are standing in the way of common sense development of rural infrastructure. Another example of some federal policies that are standing in the way, and I think this is something that many of you have run into, is that the universal broadband's criteria for applications is tied to ISED's current mapping of what level of connectivity different regions of the province have. And on paper, they say a lot of you actually have 50/10 speeds, but all of you know that in practice, that's not what you're receiving. And this is another big problem, because many of you are deemed ineligible for the UBF supports by the feds because of what some bureaucrat says is a fact on paper, when in practice it's inaccurate. And so this is something that is a big priority for me. I want you to know I'm aware of this issue. And this is why it was so important for Alberta, as a part of our broadband strategy, to collaborate with the feds, because this way we get to be equal partners with them in dispersing funding to projects that matter in Alberta, and we can be there at the table as we are deciding and evaluating projects and comparing the applications against the criteria to say, hey, you know what? Just because ISED's maps say this community is ineligible, you know what? We know, and we have evidence from the ground that says that they should be eligible. And so you can count on me to fight every single day as we work with our partners in the federal government to ensure that as we roll out and make decisions about who will be eligible and who will receive this funding, that I am not focused about what the papers say and the reports say. I'm focused on outcomes. My goal is to make sure that people on the ground actually are receiving high quality, reliable, high-speed internet. So count on me as an ally. And what I would say to all of you is, if your community is running into that problem, please contact my office to let me know and give me whatever information you have to support that, so that we can use that as we continue to work with our partners in the federal government. So we've talked a little bit about the problem. We've talked a little bit about where we've come from and where we are today with the release of the Alberta Broadband Strategy, our $390 million of funding, and the matching funding we've secured from the federal government. Where do we go from here? Well, as we said, this is going to be rolled out over 4 years. Our goal is to announce the first tranche of funding. Well, my goal was 2 months ago, but the feds are slow. My apologies. The only thing holding up Tranche 1 right now is waiting for the federal government to sign off on a package that's been on their desk for 2 months. So anything you can do to urge them to be a little faster, please have at her. We're ready to roll. We think we've got a really good package ready to go. And our goal was to have shovels in the ground this construction season. We know that some of those projects might take until next year to conclude. That's okay. The key thing, I think, as you guys said before I came up on the stage, is it's all well and good to have the dollars announced, but what we really care about is seeing it rolled out and spent, and the construction beginning, and the relief being brought to the communities who need to see high-speed internet. And that's my goal too. I share that as a priority, and I'm working really hard every day to urge my counterparts in Ottawa to get with the program. We've already agreed on spending the money. We've already agreed this is a problem. We already agree on the desired outcomes. Let's just get to work with this first batch of projects. I can't tell you anything about which projects are inside that tranche, as much as I would love to, because it would be really fun to talk about that. But what I can tell you is it's a significant dollar value of the total $780 million. It's in the hundreds of millions of dollars, I can tell you that. And as soon as that is announced, as soon as that is underway, we will, of course, be looking to the next year's batch of projects, and there will essentially be 4 years of projects announced over the next 4 years, with the intent to have all of the construction wrapped up in the next 5 to 6 years, which is what our goal is for reaching universal connectivity. One of the things that I do hear is, hey, you know what? This is all well and good. Yeah, it's great that you're committing this money and you've leveraged this money from the feds. But what about those of us who didn't get a chance to apply to the Universal Broadband Fund for whatever reason? And I know there's probably some of you in this room. And I want you to know I hear you. Let me touch quickly on why we chose to partner with the feds, and then talk a little bit about what we're trying to do to ensure that no community, including yours, is left behind. First, it would have been very, I think, challenging for us to try and say the feds will do their thing, we'll do our thing, and we won't talk to each other. Because ultimately what happens then is that everybody's going to have to apply to 2 different programs. They won't look the same. There'll be different packages or different criteria, different processes. It's going to be an enormous amount of hurdles to get this off the ground and get it running. By partnering with the UBF, we could ensure that we could get dollars out the door faster, because it was a process that had already been underway for a couple of years, and the feds already had some engineering in-house expertise to do a lot of the due diligence, and we're able to support that and amplify it and accelerate that process. It would have taken longer to do it on our own. If we had done it on our own, we also wouldn't have had coordination. And because this is a billion-dollar problem, if the feds go and invest in one project with one partner over here, and the province invests in a competing project, not knowing about that other one with a different provider, you're duplicating that infrastructure. We don't have the ability to take those risks. We cannot duplicate infrastructure, because then a billion-dollar problem turns into a $2 billion problem, and we don't have the resources for that. So we do need to coordinate, and that's one of the reasons why it was really important for us to work with the federal government. But I acknowledge that, that there are some circumstances where, for whatever reason, a certain region was not able to get a project for their area in front of the UBF before the cutoff. I want you to know that I see you, I hear you, and I want to hear from you. And I encourage you to reach out to my office, and we'll make sure that through the Cybera team that information is available to all of you by the end of this event, so that you know where to come to if you don't already know how to reach my broadband team. But we want to hear from you, and we want to work with you. I want to get through this first tranche with the feds first through the UBF, and then we will work on saying how far is that likely to get us, what regions are underserved or underrepresented and unlikely to be served through the UBF, and how do we try and think outside the box and work together to make sure that none of you are left behind. So I want you to know I'm aware that this is an issue, that probably some of the communities represented by those of you in this room are probably seeing that as a challenge, and we are eager to try and find a way to overcome that challenge. But for starters, we're focused on getting the first tranche of investment out the door. So number one, you know that the full $780 million is real, because we're starting with the first few $100 million. And then number two, we can start discussing together how are we going to build beyond what that first tranche of projects is going to unlock and to cover. So I've touched on pretty much most of the high-level things in the broadband strategy that I wanted to cover initially. I'm sure there might be some questions you have that I didn't think of covering, and with that I'm happy to pause and just say thank you for having me. Thanks for hearing me out. I hope you're encouraged. I know the devil's in the details, and we still have a few more things to show to you before you'll be celebrating with me. But I hope you're encouraged that we are at a better place today than we have ever been in the last 10 years in respect of solving the digital divide. And I want you to know this is one of my #1 top priorities as a minister. It's something I'm very passionate about. I want to be able to see this through, and I know that to do that, I need to work with all of you. So I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister Glubish, and we'll take some questions then.
Quick question. So you're talking about the projects being shovel-ready, essentially. Does that mean that the first round of, or the first trench of projects that you're looking at are all from the RRS submissions, or are they from the regular UBF submissions?
No, the RRS, the Rapid Response Stream, that is separate from our deal with the federal government. Our deal is strictly on the main application package of the UBF. Not all of those projects are necessarily going to be shovel ready to start this summer, but some of them will be. And my goal is to make sure that we get at least some construction started this season so that we can prove to all Albertans this is real. And not every project is going to start this season, but we need to demonstrate some immediate relief and progress, and that is a priority for me. But there will continue to be others that will trickle into next year, and then, as I said, there will be 4 years worth of tranches of investment to announce, including this first one. I see a couple hands.
Hi. We've submitted a couple of projects into the UBF. We were successful on the rapid response for Sunset Point. I'm wondering what percentage of UBF projects that were submitted for Alberta are being considered.
Well, we're considering every single project that's been submitted. What I can tell you is the number of applications that came to the UBF in Alberta, it was second only to Ontario. It was one of the most active provinces in terms of appetite and applications. We're talking hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of applications, and we're looking at every single one of them along with the feds. And we have looked at actually every single one of them and have ranked those. And as I said, we have sort of our first tranche that we have signed off on. We're just waiting for the feds. That doesn't mean that none of the other ones will make the cut. It just means this is the first pass. Let's iron out the rest of the details with the partners who are successful in those applications, see how much coverage that will help us to build, and then go back to the applications to say what's the next level of partners that we want to negotiate with, and how much farther does that take us. And we'll do it in a staged approach. It's important to also do it in a staged approach because then you can focus on the most strategic, highest value, highest impact areas first, see how far you get, and then make a better informed decision about the next round. It's also important not to do it all at once because supply chain issues, right? Like you all are probably aware of the fact that the supply chain issues that have been presented by the global pandemic are very real, and supply chain issues for fiber and for the electronics tied to fiber networks is very real. And so if we were to try and just do everything all at once, it would be impossible to get the supplies. And even if we got more of it, it would be at highly inflated prices. And so then we would, again, $1 billion problem becomes a $2 billion problem, becomes a $3 billion problem. So it is important to do it in stages. And that will allow for the engineering teams to have enough time to design and plan for all of the different projects. And it'll also ensure that the construction crews who have the expertise to build this will have the time to build out all of these projects. So I hope that gives you a little bit of insight in terms of why it's in stages, but definitely there's lots of interest through the UBF, and just because something might not make the first tranche doesn't mean it won't be considered or hasn't been considered as a part of that process.
Budgets that were presented in those UBF projects now are not going to be anywhere near what the actual costs are going to be later on. Would that mean that the Alberta government would help supplement the differences in those projects?
So I'm definitely aware that inflation and some of the supply chain issues could change the dynamics of each of those applications. We're aware of that, and we're working with the federal government as we continue to consider each of these projects to ensure that any projects that would make it to conditional approval, which would be the first stage, that then we sit down with those teams and say, how realistic is this? What does this really look like? And is this still viable? Does this still make sense? So the short answer is we're not exactly sure what that will look like, but the key thing is we will be meeting with all of the shortlisted applicants who make it to a conditional approval to negotiate the finer points on any project before anyone is required to put any dollars on the table. Good question, thanks. In the back?
Yeah, thank you. Can you provide any philosophical guidelines that comes into your head when you're evaluating? Like the one in particular that I'm interested in is how is private investment viewed in an application where the municipal comes in with some private comes in and or a top up, the net result being you're multiplying your money. Curious how that weighs, and then as a spin-off on that for their private investment is being candid. How heavy is the bias towards the typical incumbents, i.e. TELUS?
Good question. So first of all, I want to work with any telco or ISP. I don't care who it is. If they have a good plan, then they should be at the table. And of course, the larger incumbents have big teams and lots of engineers and lots of capital. And so they're logically going to be at the table. But I am open to and have made it very clear that I will work with anybody who has a plan that is a credible plan to help us tackle some of these issues. There will be different organizations are going to have different advantages in different corners of the province, right? So you might have a community where a smaller player already has some existing infrastructure, and they're saying, hey, all I want to do is just expand, within a couple kilometers of where I already am. And nobody's willing to do it because it's cost prohibitive, but we can do it if we have this amount of support because we can leverage our existing infrastructure. Well, that to me is a very compelling argument, right? Because instead of having to go to an established big player and say, well, they got to trench some fiber from 50 kilometers away, these guys can say, well, I already have something and I just need to either do a little bit more fiber or do a wireless tower or whatever it might be. If they've got a plan like that, I'm very open to that and would strongly encourage them to continue working through the process to make their case. I have no bias towards any player. I've also made that very clear in terms of who I'm willing to meet with. I don't just meet with TELUS, Shaw, Rogers, etc. I meet with everybody. I meet with the folks who have, tens of thousands of employees, the people who have 100 employees, and the people who have 2 employees. And I give them all the same amount of my time and the same access to my staff and my department. It's important to me to show to them that I want us all to work together and for everyone to have the same information so that they can put their best foot forward. And if we do that, then all Albertans will win. In terms of the first question, for part of your question, just remind me again, what was
when you're doing your evaluation?
Yeah, right. Yeah. The evaluation part. So absolutely, leveraging other sources of capital is a significant factor for us. That's very logical, right? If there's a project, if there's 2 projects, all else equal, that are going to do exactly the same thing, but one of them's, the private sector partner is willing to do 40% of the project, and the other one's willing to do 20% of the project, all else equal, we're going to go with the one that's putting more dollars behind. That's just common sense. And I think that's the best thing we can do on behalf of Alberta taxpayers is let's seek to get the best value we can for them with the investment and the supports that we're offering. But that, on its own, right, that's assuming all else equal. There are other factors we need to be mindful of. So for me, there's a few different pillars. Obviously, you guys are familiar with the UBF and their criteria. As we are partnering with the feds, the things that are important to me beyond that criteria that we've agreed to in our partnership is to say, how do we get maximum value for our dollars, which ties into what you just raised, but how do we balance that with regional fairness, right? Because this is a problem that is everywhere in the province, every corner of the province, and we need to make sure that as we roll this out, that every corner of the province is going to see some progress. The first year is not going to get universal connectivity. The second year is not going to get universal connectivity. It's going to take 4 years of investments and 5 or 6 years of construction to get there. But we need to make sure that no region feels like they're being ignored. And so that factors into part of the decision. Another piece that goes hand in hand with that is that we need to be mindful of our First Nations partners, right? The First Nations communities are the hardest hit by the rural digital divide. They have the least coverage, the least quality of the lowest quality of service, and we do have an obligation in terms of reconciliation and ensuring that our First Nations partners have the opportunity to participate in the modern digital economy and to access the same important education supports and healthcare supports and the many other things that connectivity will unlock. And so the challenge is that those are the hardest to reach communities and the most expensive to reach communities. So while the first pillar I said was getting the maximum value for a given dollar invested, we need to balance that while saying we also need to see progress for our First Nations partners, because if we don't do that, then we have failed. So what you can expect from me as we roll out different phases of this is trying to find that balance between those 3 key pillars: maximum value for dollar, regional fairness, and First Nations representation in the projects. So hopefully that gives you some insight. Short answer is I'm not 100% sure, but what I would suggest, if you're aware of a project where that might be in the consideration for next steps, I would just strongly urge, if the municipality is involved in that, or if it's just being led by a telco or an ISP, fine, that doesn't matter. But whoever it is that is involved in making that decision, I would urge them to work closely with my department. And again, we'll make sure that you all have the contact info for my broadband team leader, Holly Salo, and make sure that you talk to her before you make those decisions so that you can have the best information possible. I'm not at a position right now where I could say one way or another for sure, but what I can promise you is we will make sure that my team is available to yours to make sure that you have those answers before you've made a commitment. Fair enough?
I'm going to jump in here for a quick. I'm piggybacking a little bit on what Brian has already said, and what I'm looking at is not necessarily on the current UBF applications that are sitting there, but the criteria in future UBF applications. We already know our largest hurdle right now is that the vast majority of the folks in this room do not meet the initial criteria, which is that you already are supposedly have sufficient service. So how are you, short of us telling you, hey, we don't have service, how do we work towards understanding what other hurdles we're facing? Because there are truly, I guess this is a long ramble, there's no criteria other than you meet our criteria to apply for a UBF. You guys aren't telling us what you're evaluating them on. You aren't saying, other than we need an ISP, you're basically saying, do you need service? Okay, apply. But there has to be more criteria than that you can share with us so we can write our applications to be evaluated correctly.
So I mean, the UBF is pretty clear what its criteria is, and I would encourage you to make sure that you are clear on what that is and prepare any applications accordingly. To whatever extent you are unsure, then please work with my department. I've said this to anybody who wants to work on investing in and building infrastructure, that my team is there to support you and to work with you to make sure you have all of the information you need to reach your fullest potential, and to make sure that if that lack of information does not stand in your way of putting forward a strong package. So as I've said on previous questions, if you are unsure, then please reach out to Holly in my office. We'll make sure you have that contact info, and we will work with you to make sure you have the information you need. That I think is one of the roles that the provincial government can play beyond just putting dollars into this, right? We can be a clearinghouse for information because we have the relationships with the federal government at a level that each of you, it would be unrealistic for you to develop the same level of relationship that we have with them. Right? They can't engage with hundreds of you, but they can engage with one of me. And so my team is able to help make sure that we can then support you with that information. And similarly with the conversations we have with the hundreds of municipalities that we're working with at any given time, we can try and say, is there something you haven't considered that could be helpful to your situation? But we can only help you if you reach out to us. So I urge you, please make sure you do that. Our partnership with the federal government is to disperse these funds through the Universal Broadband Fund. So it is Universal Broadband Fund criteria. Now, as we are considering which projects we want to advocate for with our partners in the federal government, beyond the criteria that is there, it's the three pillars I shared with you here today: maximizing value for a dollar invested, ensuring regional fairness, and ensuring some level of responsible First Nation participation.
So I have a question. Just in your presentation, you talk about getting the infrastructure out there, get it in the ground, and prioritizing, all else being equal, the folks that are going to put more capital up front to help maximize the dollar. So to me, this sounds like telecommunication companies or large telco companies are going to, all else being equal, have more money or more skin in the game. But we know, or I know coming from a municipality, that simply having the infrastructure in place isn't good enough, particularly when dealing with larger telecommunication companies. So is there consideration for any provisions to be in place that say, set some parameters or sets of rules or rates for telecommunications to be charging folks who are lower income or have less affordability, to make it truly accessible to everybody and really close that digital divide, because we know that infrastructure isn't good enough. We still need rates that are accessible to the community.
So a couple of things in there. First of all, I think it is important to recognize what is within the realm of provincial jurisdiction and what is not. Regulation of telecommunications is federal jurisdiction. Full stop. I have no control over that. So if you're talking about affordability and access, I can't go and regulate pricing. I can't go and tell a telecommunication company what they can and can't do. My role is to say we believe universal connectivity is important. It's a goal we want to support, and we're willing to invest $390 million to help make that happen. And we are going to partner with the feds to unlock their money as well, and work with them to make sure we direct their money and ours to the best projects possible that meet Alberta's goals. But I don't have the tools or the power to mandate pricing, for example. That might be a good question for the CRTC tomorrow to ask what their thoughts are on that. But what I can tell you is that before we will agree to and enter into an agreement, a legal contract with any successful bidders to get supportive funding from the province and the feds, we will make sure that we've had conversations about what is this actually going to look like once you've built it? Is it really going to deliver the speeds you've promised? Because we're going to hold you to that. You will be required to deliver these results, not just build infrastructure, right? To your point, it's not just the infrastructure on its own is not enough. The outcome is what is important. Does this really give a certain level and standard of service, and is it accessible? These are the things that we will certainly be having in our discussions and our negotiations with any of these shortlisted conditional approval partners. And our goal is your goal. Make sure that this gets everybody in Alberta high quality, reliable, high speed internet, and making sure that it is accessible, which includes affordable. And so we will be making sure that we use the stick we have as we're negotiating these contracts before we will commit any dollars to these projects to ensure that those outcomes are going to be met as a part of this. Because otherwise, we will have failed the Alberta taxpayer and built something that isn't meeting their needs.
Well, Minister Glubish, I know you are a very busy person, and you were very sharp at 4:30, and we don't want to keep you any longer than you can make it. So,
oh wow, time flies when you're having fun.
Well, we'll have more conversations, certainly amongst this group and with Holly and with your team. But if everyone wants to join me in thanking the minister for coming and talking a little bit about the strategy and taking the questions on it as well.
Just thank you so much for having me. I'm hopeful that you can tell from our conversation today, this is something that's really important to me, and I really care deeply about this. And I know that just talking about dollars doesn't really matter. What matters is the proof with projects in the ground and results in your homes and in your communities. I want you to know I am committed to seeing this through. I will work with you in all of your communities and all of your levels of government and any partners that you may be wanting to work with to do everything I can to help you see results in your community over the next 4 or 5 years. And thank you for hearing me out. I hope this gave you a little bit more clarity. And I'm sure there will still be more questions as we go, but it is a work in progress. The good news is hope is here, and there are dollars allocated to this, and that is a huge step forward compared to the last 10 years. So thank you for hearing me out, and looking forward to connecting with you more in the future.
Thank you.